By now you know that the FDA has approved the first new drug aimed at treating Alzheimer's disease in the last 18 years. Our prior drugs have focused on helping the symptoms of the disease. This new drug purportedly works at the cause of the disease, buildup of amyloid plaques in the brain. And you would think I would be jumping for joy at this announcement, but it's controversial, and some researchers are very angry. I find myself stuck in the middle between these two extremes. Hello, I'm Dr. Renee Harmon. I'm the author of Surfing the Waves of Alzheimer's. It's a memoir about my husband Harvey and his time with younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Prior to his diagnosis, Harvey and I were primary care physicians together in a shared family medicine practice. And I have thought that if this drug had come out in the very earliest stages of his disease, I probably would have been cautiously optimistic and would have pushed for him to try the medication. If the announcement had come during his middle or late stages of the disease, I probably would not have. And that's because if the drug truly does halt progression of the disease, I would not have wanted him stuck in those very difficult stages. So let me tell you about the kind of the history of Aducanumab and where we're coming from and why it's controversial. So Aducanumab was studied in two large clinical trials called the Engage trial and the Emerge trial. In 2019, it was concluded from both of these studies that the drug did not have any effect on the functioning or cognition of the study participants. Just a few months after that, however, when the scientists removed the patients who had been given a low dose of the drug, when they removed those from the statistics, reran the numbers, it did look like the study participants in the Emerge trial only showed some very minimal effectiveness in function and cognition. It did not show any change to placebo in the Engage trial. So the FDA granted its approval based on this slim change after they redid the numbers, but also based on a surrogate endpoint. The primary endpoint was increased function and cognition. The surrogate endpoint was clearing of amyloid from the brain. Now, we've known from prior studies of prior drugs in this category, and these are all monoclonal antibodies against amyloid. All the other studies against different iterations of this monoclonal antibody have been able to show clearing of amyloid from the brain, but none of them have been able to show improvement in cognition and function. Why that is, we don't know. So that brings me to side effects. So not only do we know that these drugs clear amyloid, but all the other studies also show the same side effect that's showing up in Aducanumab. 40% of patients show small bleeding in the brain and or swelling of the brain. And we think that's because when you remove amyloid from the blood vessels of the brain, they become leaky and they can leak out they can leak out blood and cause swelling of the brain. And study participants get regularly scheduled MRIs to monitor this specific side effect. And that brings me to cost. So by now you've probably heard that Aducanumab is going to cost $56,000 a year per person for these infusions. That doesn't take into account the PET scans that are going to have to be done to definitively diagnose Alzheimer's disease. These PET scans are still considered investigational and are not usually covered by health insurances. They're going to need regular MRIs to look for this side effect, also not usually covered by health insurances. The main controversy seems to be, or is the expert panel. So the FDA approves drugs after it goes through several steps, but one of the steps is an expert panel of researchers look at this drug. So this panel that looked at Aducanumab are all researchers in the neurologic field, but ones that do not have a horse in the game. So they were not any of the participants in the study. They were not any of the researchers in the study. So this unbiased group, this panel, 10 of them voted no on approval. 1 of them voted uncertain. There were no yes votes. So why did the FDA override its own expert panel? I've always respected the FDA in its task in bringing to market effective, safe medications. It can be cumbersome and take a long time, but the process has given us safe and effective medications in large. So why would they overrule their own experts? Was there outside forces that were pushing them to just approve anything new for Alzheimer's disease? Were Alzheimer's advocates pushing really hard for this? Is there some political pressure? I don't know. It's just not good science. And there are other aspects that we need to remember about this medication and its approval too. So because it specifically targets amyloid, it will not be used in other forms of dementia. So it will not be used to treat Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia. The FDA has approved this medication for all Alzheimer's disease patients, not just those in the earliest phases of the disease, like the study participants were, but all Alzheimer's disease patients. So those patients and their families are going to have to decide, like I talked about earlier, whether or not it's worth possibly halting the progression of the disease in those very difficult to manage middle and late stages, right? 2, there are millions of patients that this drug has now been approved for. Our healthcare system will be overwhelmed if a large enough proportion of them request this drug. Our healthcare system is not set up to deal with that. So I know it sounds like I am not a fan of this FDA approval for this expensive, possibly dangerous, minimally effective drug, but I do find some hope in this saga. We've been studying these drugs for about 15 years now, and though we have not been able to show good outcomes, some other good things have come out of them. We now have ways to definitively diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So prior to these studies, we would say that Alzheimer's disease could only be diagnosed at autopsy. Well, we now have PET scans, which pick up amyloid signals in the brain very specifically, so we can specifically diagnose Alzheimer's disease now. We can also do a lumbar puncture, which shows fragments of this amyloid protein in the spinal fluid. And there's a very promising blood test that's being developed where we can also detect fragments of this abnormal protein in the blood of patients who are at potential risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later. We know from these studies that we've been doing that Alzheimer's disease, before it becomes symptomatic, you're actually seeing amyloid plaque in the brain sometimes decades prior to symptoms. So if we have a blood test that can screen for possible onset of Alzheimer's disease, if we have a treatment, maybe we can prevent or significantly delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease in these patients who have a positive blood screen test. That's exciting to me. And that is a research project that I would willingly sign up for, right? That's my opinion. Be well and keep your balance.